Something you mentioned was that sometimes in states, illegal fishing is not necessarily considered that much of a serious crime. And this is something I've heard more often, also with a recent episode that I recorded, which will be published shortly after this one, where I'm talking to a representative of the Kenyan Fishery Service, where he said it took really a lot of convincing that, for government officials, for instance, that, just like on land, laws need to be enforced at sea. Like, it sounds maybe a little bit odd for us because we focus so much on it, but maybe you do have that thing where it's out of sight, it's out of mind. Can you speak a little bit about this and how this would impact the ability to enforce sanctions against offenders?
You're completely right. I think it's also sometimes if you perhaps talk to people who are not necessarily involved in fisheries, then it's a bit like, well, if they get 20 fish, 30, what does it really matter?
Mm-hmm.
I think there are also some practical issues, I think, where perhaps authorities are not so find it difficult to enforce because on land you have a police force. On sea, I think if you want to investigate, if you want to monitor, let's say this kind of fisheries crime, it demands quite a bit of resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can be very expensive.
If you are a government, then you sometimes have to balance the kind of thing like, do we really prioritize it, or are we going after murderers or other things? And in particular, it doesn't feel like not necessarily it's environmental crime, and I think we see that now more and more coming up. But it's not necessarily an environmental crime that directly affects somebody living on land, where I think we
Mm-hmm.
would immediately say like, okay, this has to happen. So I think it's that. I think what we also have seen, what I've seen in my research, is that quite a lot of the regulations, the fisheries regulations, are quite outdated. So if you talk, for example, about evidence, I think if you need to prove that somebody has been involved in illegal fishing. That doesn't mean that you actually have to see it happening, or can you also detect it let's say, in other ways? And I think in my research, which I focused a bit on West Africa, I see that quite a lot of the regulations actually, have this kind of very traditional crime kind of detection concept, is that you need to see it happening, or the police needs to see it happening in order to criminalize. So I think the possibility of having a successful prosecution could be quite limited. Then I think the other thing is, what actually some of the things we just discussed, is the fact like, well, it's nice, but if the people with the pockets are not located in the country, what's the point? Because we cannot really enforce it. So we cannot really do much about it. I must say, I mean, of course, there are domestic situations that may be different. So there may be, if that's also sometimes mean that it's a bit sad that quite often the small scale fishers are probably more subjected to penalties and fines than the industrial ones, because it's much easier to enforce it. If you look at it in some developing states, and then in particular in kind of international cases, there may also be reluctance to do something. For example, in the minds of some countries, some developing countries, at allowing fishermen from, let's say, the EU to do activities within their waters that are not necessarily fully compliant with the law, and they may fear that by acting against these vessels, they may actually also impact their relationship with the EU. And I think the similar things also, for example, with China. So it's sometimes you feel that there's also a bit of impunity for, let's say, more diplomatic, political reasons. So it's quite a complex arena. But I hope, let's say, that's yeah. And I think the other thing which you also sometimes see again during my research is it's not nice to say, but let's say in some countries the fisheries authorities are also quite corrupt, which is another reason why things just stay as they are.
You have, of course, some practical or legal challenges you can pinpoint. Like, it is hard and expensive to enforce crime at sea. Of course, it's such an international sector. There will generally always be multiple states that have some claim of jurisdiction. The fisheries regulations, they may be outdated. So how they handle evidence, it may be not so much fit for at-sea operations. But also beyond those kind of challenges, you have, of course, corruption or bad governance, as we're supposed to say. And you have politics, and you see that a lot, particularly when it comes to China. We know that there's challenges there, but somehow they've never gotten an EU, IUU red or
Yeah,
yellow
yeah,
card,
yeah.
interestingly enough. But also culture. And that is something that I run into a lot with the legal analysis I do for some NGOs that are working in the space of fisheries transparency, where they're like, oh, but why is their practice different? Because what I'm telling them is that on law, like on paper, the laws are pretty much the same when it comes to like data protection or protection of trade secrecy, all those things. And I can really only pinpoint it down to just a difference in culture, where there are some countries where there is a much stronger empathy for, okay, there's a right to commercial activity, there's a right to like protect some of that information, there's a right for people to fish and benefit from the natural resources in that sense. And then you have other countries where it's more like, you can exploit natural resources, but it ultimately belongs to the people, meaning that whatever you're doing there, we're going to fully transparently communicate about that to the rest of the people. So it's really hard sometimes to pinpoint, but it will ultimately really, if law only goes so far, and you have to kind of put on that layer sometimes of whether it be in culture or politics.
And I think what sometimes also does not really help is, I mean, where you see laws being updated or changed. Generally, that's done in particularly in developing countries, also with assistance from, let's say, foreign consultants that may actually come with things that are not very practical in, in reality. And so you can have for example, you can have a very interesting, very up-to-date fisheries laws with everything there and providing for the most modern kind of technology for providing evidence. But of course, the country doesn't have that technology.
Yeah.
And I think in my experience, what I've found, and that's perhaps also one of the, let's say, the reasons why I started to look at it, is that again, in West Africa, what you see that there's quite a lot of assistance, consultancy, and everything being provided also by the EU to update, harmonize rules, improve technology, improve capacity, and so on. And yeah, it's nice because then they're in a better position to detect violation. But then on the other hand, quite a number of these vessels that are engaged in illegal fishing are actually beneficially owned by people in the EU.
In Spain.
So
Yeah.
in Spain, for example. So it feels also a bit like that it's kind of, I would say, kind of a pointless exercise. But if you try to get people there enthusiastic to act against this violation, then yeah, it's also important that the countries that are supposedly more advanced and supposedly also care about this issue, that they also show locally that they do so.
And also sometimes a challenge with some of these, whether it being development aid or capacity building issues, that it's a temporary fix or it's maybe a donation, but the whole system that should exist around it, it may not still be there. Like I've heard an example of a donation by the Netherlands, for instance, of to a coastal state where there was also a lack of enforcement for any IUU activity. And so they donated a lot of patrol boats, and they were not being used. And then at some point, it's like, why is it not being used? It's because, well, petrol also costs money and it's not always budgeted in. And we need to have staff. Like, who are you going to put on those boats? Like, they're not self-operating vehicles. So
No,
it's sometimes it sounds easy to fix, but it really must be a much broader system to support it as well.